Guraburi and welcome to the National Gallery of Australia. My name is Adriane Boag and today I'm in conversation with Deborah Hart, curator of the exhibition Hugh Ramsay. To start, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri custodians of the land on which the National Gallery of Australia is built, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to also welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with us today. So to start, Deborah, let us set the scene for our conversation. In just a few days, the 80-odd works on the walls in this exhibition are going to be taken down and returned to their owners. Can you tell us a little bit about what it takes to bring an exhibition or a retrospective of this scale together?
Well, thank you, Adriane. It's lovely to be here today and such a special opportunity to be able to farewell the Hugh Ramsay exhibition and also to share it with audiences on this live stream. So, I've been interested in the work of Hugh Ramsay for some time. I remember many years ago coming across this self-portrait in front of the easel that Hugh painted in Paris and being quite intrigued by the way that he is both coming from the 19th century but also stepping into the 20th century. It's a very focused portrait and something that I really admired. And when I was given the chance to work on this retrospective, I thought it was a great opportunity to really delve into the works. It's about a quarter of a century, a little bit more, since the last retrospective. And I did find that a lot of people really didn't know who Hugh Ramsay was. So I think from the perspective of the National Gallery, it was really bringing his work to light, introducing a great body of works to new audiences, as well as people who had a sense of Ramsay, but perhaps wanted to see the works brought together. So I travelled around looking at state and regional galleries. Sometimes I went into basements, I went to university collections, I went to private collections, and people were very generous in giving access to the works, particularly those people who treasured them in the way that, I feel I was feeling as well, wanting to bring these works to light. And, the Ramsay family have been very generous in terms of the gifts to galleries, so I think people wanted to acknowledge that.
Yeah, lovely. I mean, that's quite a lovely segue, because in the exhibition catalogue, the director of the National Gallery, Nick Mitsevich, writes, "He defied the odds." Who was Hugh Ramsay and why is he important?
Yeah, so, he was born in 1877 in Scotland. He came out as a young baron, a little one, and he grows up in Melbourne. But, it's 1877 to 1906, so it's an incredibly short life. He dies of tuberculosis in 1906. And as Nick says, he really defies the odds because he creates an enormous amount in that short time. He's very driven, he's very dedicated, and something that we see in the exhibition is this closeness to his family. Right from the early days, there's a sense of great camaraderie among his siblings. Typical of that time, they were often quite big families, and there was great fun in the household in Essendon, where they moved when Ramsay was 10 years old. And I wanted to introduce the exhibition with portraits of his sisters. So one of the earliest portraits that we see is his sister Madge, and it's painted just after their mother dies, so she's dressed in her black dress, still in mourning, but you get that closeness already. And also there's another portrait of his sister Jessie with doll. So these two, you get the black dress and then you get this wonderful white dress of Jessie and the doll. And I think this is extremely important, this painting, because it's like a signifier of what was to come.
Yes.
And it really shows you what a child prodigy he was, because he's still pretty young. And one of the great things I found when I was curating the show was that we have these wonderful letters that are part of the National Gallery's archive.
Yes.
So in those letters, he talks about how he starts off struggling with this portrait of Jessie. He has her in different poses. Initially, she's sitting down. Eventually, he has her standing up. And he's looking at reproductions of the work of Whistler. And I think that it's, it's interesting that a 20-year-old is already painting an image that would stand as one of the outstanding portraits of child artists, of children in the history of Australian art. So
She does look very serious, though.
Oh, she looks very serious. And you've got this very piercing gaze and, this wonderful handling of paint. But before he paints this, he actually goes to art school. So I wanted to show in that same first room the background to these works. So, as a young man, he lets his father know that he wants to be an artist, and his dad's not that pleased. Like a lot of parents, it doesn't seem like a very stable occupation. But Hugh's determined. He feels this is his vocation. So he goes to the National Gallery School in Victoria, and he starts off really in the drawing classes. It's a very traditional background to drawing and painting. But immediately, really pretty early on, Hugh stands out. The beauty.
So how old was he, Deborah?
He's 16.
Oh,
He's 16 years old. And he does these really quite exquisite drawings. And a lot of the students are really struck by his works, and also the teachers. Bernard Hall was one of the teachers at the time, and also Frederick McCubbin. Bernard was pretty strict. Fred McCubbin was very much loved by the students, but they complemented each other. So Hugh does these drawings that show young people and older people, and this is mirrored in a wall of his paintings, which do similar things. I was very lucky to work with members of a great team at the National Gallery, including Georgina Wigham, who helped me with the colours of the walls. And we have the paintings like the seated nude with her back to us on this kind of soft mauve colour that kind of really helps the flesh tones stand out. Because that was something that Hugh was really known for, this beautiful painting of the skin tones. And, there's a sense of mystery in this painting of the nude with her back to us. We have the hair parted, the nape of her neck is kind of quite sensual, but it's very contained. Something I found really interesting, and this harks back a bit to that first portrait we talked about, is the way that Hugh directs our focus of attention. I began by thinking some of the works were unfinished, but in fact, I don't think so. I think it's that he really knows where he wants to take our focus. So, these are quite exceptional works that he does as a young artist, and apparently the teachers, especially Bernard Hall, used to occasionally draw onto other students' works, but he never touched Hugh's work.
So do you think that these early works signal these sort of later interests of Ramsay, like interest in portraiture, but also his ability to paint these different textures, the hair, the skin?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think this really sets the background. We do have landscapes and still lives in the exhibition, but really the thing that stands out in terms of Ramsay's achievement is his figure studies and his portraits. So the portraits of children, the figure studies in that first room really set the scene for the rest of the exhibition.
Thank you. So Hugh Ramsay travelled to Europe in 1900. He'd really wanted this experience for some time. Can you tell us about what the allure of Paris was for a young Australian painter at the turn of the century?
So yes, like a lot of Australian artists at that time, Ramsay was very keen to get there. He, like a number of others, enters the travelling scholarship, and he's not successful. So a number of people really got together to help him to get to Paris. It's one of the really uplifting aspects of this story is that artists were very supportive of Ramsay, and they could see his talent. So they help him, he raises money, there's an auction of works, he actually sells one of his works that helps contribute to the boat fare. And one of the great things on the ship going over to London in the first instance was that George and Amy Lambert were on the ship. And we have a very affecting, poignant portrait of Amy Lambert in the exhibition. And in fact, George and Amy Lambert become his closest friends in Paris. There are a lot of other artists there, but they were very close. And so Ramsay is excited about the opportunity. You know, Paris offered a chance to see many of the great works that he'd only seen in reproduction.
Yes.
And it's a little bit hard perhaps for us today to recognize how, you know, actually seeing things in the real was something that was really sought after. And to get to see the Louvre, the Musée Luxembourg, you know, this was a source of great excitement. And also to be with artists from around the world. You know, we talk about globalization as if it's something new, but actually Paris was a meeting place for artists from Japan, from the US, from Eastern Europe. So, you know, it was a very exciting milieu to be part of.
So I think that that's interesting because in the exhibition, a lot of the works that he makes in Paris are in fact created in his studio. And with himself as the model. He paints some of his colleagues and friends, and perhaps you'll describe some of the other people he met. But it's what really strikes one in the exhibition is really the number of self-portraits. Can you tell us a little bit about the studio and the importance of the studio for Ramsay?
Absolutely. So he gets to Paris and he's invited to share a studio in Montparnasse with James MacDonald. And the studio is like above this soda factory, and it's at the top of a building, and it's freezing cold. You know, we tend to romanticize these things, and there was definitely a romantic bohemian aspect of this, but it was also pretty tough. The conditions were not great. And he has this studio that itself becomes the subject of a number of works. And there's one that I particularly love that has this blank canvas. It's like he's really looking at the aspect of working in the studio. And so it's almost as if he's stepped out of the frame and is looking back at the studio. And in the studio, we can see that there's a piano, there's his canvas, and, you know, and then he also starts to use himself as a model. And as you said,
I'll just interrupt for a moment,
sure.
but that painting that you mentioned of the studio with the blank canvas, it's almost like he puts us as the viewer, like, okay, so here's the blank canvas, it's huge, like, where do you start?
Exactly.
What do you paint?
It's like it's he's giving us the spaces between the notes. You know, that Mallarmé idea that that the emptiness is important as the fullness, and so he's really asking a question. And clearly, it was a painting that was important to him because it appears in the background of another painting later on. And so, you know, while he's in the studio, you know, he has limited funds. Obviously, using yourself as a model helps save money. And it's also kind of quite a contemporary thing in a way, you know, that you can focus on yourself from different points of view. So depending on the outfit you're wearing, how you position yourself in the studio. You know, he would go out during the day and he'd be looking at the great works. You know, he was seeing portraits in the Louvre. They set the bar really high. You know, he writes about this in his letters. Then he goes back to his studio. Sometimes he's at art classes, then he goes back to the studio, and we have one of him wearing a white jacket in the studio. And we see him really kind of pitting himself against some of the greats. You know, he could see Sargent at the Musée Luxembourg, for example. He could see some of the other great self-portraits, Hans Holbein's portraits in different museums. And so, you know, in the self-portrait with a white jacket, he paints himself quite formally. He brings himself close into our vision, you know, close up to the viewer. In other works, like where he's showing himself in the context of other works in the studio, I find this really interesting because he's actually showing us his paintings with their backs turned to us. He's showing us the stretcher bars. He's showing us the studio as a place of work. He's got his sleeves rolled up, and he's there kind of looking at himself. Obviously, he's looking into a mirror. He's also looking at us as the audience. And, you know, he's channeling Velázquez a little bit, that great Las Meninas. But what's always important is what artists do with those influences, how they make it their own. And he really makes it his own.
So this expanded world and opportunity to really, like you mentioned before, see the works in real life rather than through reproductions was just really important to his development as an artist. But one of the things that I like you to tell us about is what was success in Paris at that time, and how and did Ramsay manage to participate in what success meant?
Yeah, so, we've just been looking at these portraits. There's one of him in his smoking jacket where we have the piano behind him. And just to come to your question in a moment, the piano features a lot. Music is really important to him. And, it is kind of like a love letter to his fiancée who's back in Australia. He's actually wearing an engagement ring. In that portrait, he's quite smartly dressed, and there's a beautiful still life in it as well. So, he's really working hard in the studio. He's going out and looking at great works. And then to answer your question, how do you measure success? So a lot of artists were entering works into the salons, into the old salon and the new salon. And Ramsay has this tremendous experience. He enters 5 works into the new salon in 1902. We have to put this in the context that he wasn't socializing all that much. We have very little evidence of him in the cafes. He's driving himself in the studio. And he then enters these works in the new salon, and 4 of the 5 works are accepted.
It's amazing.
It is amazing because, as he writes to his dad, and we remember his dad wasn't so keen on him becoming an artist, so he's kind of going, hey, Dad, look at this. I've actually got 4 works when even 1 would have done. And he shares that success in a letter to his father. And one of the works that's included in the new salon is a very beautiful portrait of a young girl, and it's Jeanne. It's the concierge's daughter. And, it's really interesting because people got it. It was reproduced in a number of articles, and it was really respected. It's a very beautiful painting which shows the influence of James McNeill Whistler.
Yes.
Many people will be familiar with Whistler's mother. It's kind of these thin veils of paint. And here he is, he's just focused this young girl on a chair in his studio, and she would have come up to model for him. And, apparently he would gently bribe her with stamps. He was getting all these wonderful letters from his siblings in Paris, and so he would give her the stamps from the letters. But again, a bit like Jessie with the doll, the face is exquisitely painted. We've got these dangling little legs, this exquisite use of colour. But to show the kind of sense of adventure, I really wanted to also show the full-length portrait. So we have A Lady of Cleveland. And this is one of the full-length portraits on a wall of portraits in the exhibition, which shows how he was pushing himself.
And this was a work also accepted by the salon.
That's exactly right. It was also accepted by the salon. And it gives you a sense of the milieu. I mentioned Americans. A Lady of Cleveland, USA, is obviously showing an American woman. There were a lot of women artists who were students in Paris, and they were all meeting together. And, there's some wonderful quotes actually about the Lady of Cleveland. Obviously, she is very beautifully dressed, and he talks about trying to get himself out of bed in the freezing cold studio in the morning, and he says, in one of his letters, I have to push myself because it wouldn't do to be abed with a beautiful young American coming to pose for me in the day. And so it's really, something that he wants to do her justice, and he paints her almost in this kind of very proper way in his studio. And it's wonderful that it gets accepted, and it's hung quite prominently on the line. And, this was a big thing for...
This is on the eye line, you mean?
On the eye line. Yes. And, we're talking about an artist exhibiting for almost the first time. So it was a pretty extraordinary achievement.
These are also very interesting portraits of women, and also sort of a hinting at sort of class differentiations, because the portrait of Jeanne, she does look very sort of subdued, slightly uncomfortable, perhaps about the intention. And A Lady of Cleveland, she's a confident, modern woman.
Exactly. Well, I think, Jeanne actually reminds me a lot of a number of child portraits where I think that also having to sit for long hours wasn't necessarily appreciated, but, it's a very, very beautiful portrait. But yes, the different kinds of portraits that he paints is interesting.
Yep. So Ramsay made a number of important connections in Europe, and one of them that was really significant was with Dame Nellie Melba. Can you tell us a little bit about what were the sort of the ramifications of his meeting with Melba?
Well, this was fantastic. You know, he got introduced to Nellie Melba through his friend, Ambrose Patterson, who was occupying a studio opposite, on the same floor of the apartment block. And so Patterson was related to Melba and gave the introduction. But Melba was also very intrigued to know who was this Australian artist doing so well, who had works accepted in the new salon. And she wants to go and visit him. And this is a cause of great excitement. So not only do we have the letters home to his dad and his auntie about, you know, the fact that he's got into the new salon, but now that he's going to meet Melba. And Melba goes to his studio. So, you know, you've got to think about it.
She was slumming it.
It's quite a daggy studio in Montparnasse, and she pulls up in this pretty fancy car. And he said, you know, he remarks on this vehicle arriving and her coming, trudging up the steps to the top of the apartment block. And he's very excited. And he said she was so lovely to him. And during the course of this sitting, he paints a portrait of Melba. Now, it's interesting, when I was showing our director around as we were hanging the exhibition, he said, you know, it's funny because the fineness of those early portraits isn't captured so much in this quite vivid portrait of Melba. And I said, yes, because it was done in 35 minutes. And so he's doing this rapid sketch, and he talks about how he has kind of sweaty palms and he's very anxious, but he's also very excited. And, you know, Melba says to him, really, I want you to do a full-length portrait of me. And,
amazing.
You know, she says, you need to come over to London. And she invites him to her home. And so this is really a turning point. So he goes to London, he travels to London, and he goes to her house, which, you know, it sounds a bit crazy. It was like apparently modelled after Versailles. So it's like this little Versailles, and he goes...
Was Melba really at the height of her powers?
Oh, she really was.
Yeah,
she was
so
a
she
megastar.
was a diva. Yeah, megastar, yeah.
She really was. And, you know, he talks in this letter about going to her house and how she brought these beautiful frocks down to, you know, behind the scenes to kind of see what he'd like to choose that she would later model in. And he gets invited to these fancy dinners. And, you know, he sort of says, you know, this is just amazing. He has never experienced anything like that. But, you know, sadly, it's when he's in London that he's diagnosed with tuberculosis. So he actually never gets to paint, to finish the full-length portrait. He does start it, and there is a sketch in the exhibition of what he intended. But unfortunately, he's then told by his doctor that he really needs to come home. Before he comes home to Australia, he does get a chance to see some really incredible works, particularly by John Singer Sargent in London, that informs what he did when he came back to Australia.
Okay, well that's... Yeah, thank you. So quite fortuitously, Ramsay and Melba travel back to Australia in 1902, and their connection doesn't end there. And at the same time, Ramsay is still very ambitious. So his ambition is undiminished, and he sets about creating some of his most ambitious works. Can you tell us a little bit about his achievements and also this sort of ongoing connection with Melba?
Yes, so when he comes back to Australia, you know, one of the good things that happens is that Melba wants to keep going with the commissions. So she commissions him to paint a portrait of her niece, Nellie Patterson, Miss Nellie Patterson. And Miss Nellie Patterson wears a frock that Melba bought in Paris. It's this gorgeous frock. It's quite a contrast to the little portrait of Jeanne.
Yes.
And, you know, Nellie is perched on a beautiful salmon cushion, which he keeps sliding off. In fact,
sort of satin, isn't it?
Satinish.
So it looks slippery. Yeah.
Exactly. And you know, the model many years later said she actually had trouble staying on that cushion, and she was given bullseye, you know, sweets to suck on to keep her from, you know, getting too bored. But it's a very beautiful child portrait again, and you really see him testing himself. And in this painting, it's a very sensuous use use of paint. And, you know, he talked about going and seeing Sargent at the Royal Academy, and he said that, you know, people say that Sargent's too clever, but actually they're wrong. You know, he shows this incredible mastery of paint. And he says when you get up close to the paint surface, it almost seems quite abstract, but when you stand at the proper distance, it all comes together. And we really see this in the portrait of Nellie Patterson. And, you know, so she commissions him, and she also commissions him to paint her father.
Okay, just before you go on to talk about that very lovely, I think one of my favourite paintings in the exhibition of her father, but we mentioned right at the beginning the painting of Jessie with the doll in the white.
Exactly.
So then now we have the second real painting of a white dress with Nellie Melba. And I just want to actually alert everybody how we're going to build on this idea of the painting of white and also the importance of Sargent.
Yeah,
but now tell us about David Mitchell.
Yeah, so, you know, in fact, it's on the different side of the spectrum in that he's wearing dark clothes. David Mitchell, Nellie Melba's father, was, she often said, the most important person in her life. And he paints this portrait of the elderly man, and apparently he hadn't been very well and he kept nodding off. But actually Ramsay manages to capture this twinkle in his eyes. You know, it's quite a vibrant portrait. Yeah. And I think this is the only little point of difference that comes through with Melba, that apparently she wasn't that happy with the painting of his hands. She thought they were too big. But, you know, Ramsay said, sorry, that's actually quite true of him. You know, he was in the building trade, and he kind of kept them as they were initially painted. But, you know, I really have to say in this context of Nellie Melba that she was quite incredible, because when she came back to Australia, she was fated. I mean, she went on these train journeys where people were doffing their caps and lining up along the railway line. And, you know, she was in such demand, but she managed to make time to organise for Ramsay to have his first and only solo exhibition in a rented home of hers in Toorak. So, you know, there's this beautiful little catalogue that we have of that exhibition, and it was really special for Ramsay. And, you know, he wrote about this first solo show, and you know, he's a wonderful personality. He's quite self-deprecating, and he says that, you know, people were so keen to see Melba. Some of them went away disappointed, but fortunately a few actually took notice of the paintings.
Oh, yes. So she was a really significant supporter, wasn't she? And it was, really an amazing connection for a young artist. So we've really covered quite a sort of a breadth of his career. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about Ramsay's work is that he really appealed to his fellow artists. And he's often referred to, and this is written about also in the catalogue, as that he was an artist's artist. I'm wondering if you can just tell us, what does that mean?
So an artist's artist, you know, as I said earlier, you know, his fellow students, I think he was a very likeable person, but I think people also really got his talent as an artist. And it is one of the uplifting things of the exhibition that his work was very much admired. You know, he painted a number of portraits of his artist friends. So, for example, we have a wonderful painting called Student of the Latin Quarter, which shows his friend Ambrose Patterson. You know, it's really a typical portrait of a student, a bohemian student. But, you know, his friends really got what he was doing. And, you know, even today, I've found a lot of artists really responding to his works, and also musicians. You know, the musician Robert Forster, for example, made a very beautiful comment. And he said, you know, Ramsay is an artist of his time, but he also transcends time. And he lives for us now. And I really loved that, because that's something that I wanted to bring out in this exhibition, that sense that the works have a presence and can talk to us now in our contemporary world.
Yes. So Ramsay was always connected to his family, and at a time like this, he turned his attention once more to those who were closest to him. His familiarity with his sisters really resulted in some of his greatest paintings. Can you tell us about Jessie with a dog, and also Two Girls in White, which has been behind us the whole time that we've been
Okay.
sitting here in the exhibition.
So, it's a very moving story because Ramsay was quite ill in the last stages of his life. But I think he took this attitude that he really had to drive himself. He felt he only had a limited time left, and rather than staying in bed, he would really try to show what he'd learned. And, he paints Jessie. We now see Jessie as a grown woman. We saw her as a young girl. She's now a grown woman, and he paints her with their dog, Lassie, the collie, and he pays great attention to the outfit. He is actually very interested in dress of the period. And it's interesting that, even though to us today it does look like a long skirt, it's showing a modern woman about to go on a walk, and it's the skirt is above the ankle line. And I really love the portrait of the dog. I feel when we're unwell, for those of us who are great animal lovers, animals bring comfort to our lives. And I think the portrait of the dog almost steals the show.
I agree with you.
But of course, the great work in the exhibition is a work that has been known for many years as The Sisters, that Ramsay himself titled Two Girls in White. He had looked at Sargent, as we said, and Sargent was known for this bravura brushstroke. And that's something we really see in this incredible portrait of his sisters, Madge and Nell. It started off with him painting Jessie, but unfortunately she had become unwell and was unable to model for him. So it's a portrait of Madge, who's the one who's sitting upright, and it's really interesting when we look closely at how Ramsay really personalizes this. And again, it gets back to that point, you learn the lessons. He was really looking at how Sargent painted, but then he makes it his own, and it's a deeply personal painting. And the more you look at it, the more it actually tells you. So Madge was the sister who he felt very close to, like Jessie. And Madge is kind of leaning forward, and she has the gloves, and she's kind of in our space, the beautiful gloves up the arm. It's almost like the Vienna Secession portraits. And, if you look carefully, you see the shadow behind her. The dress is very beautifully painted. And the coat behind her almost looks like angel wings. She was very protective of Hugh, and I think there's that element of it that comes through. Nell has a very different disposition. I think, Ramsay had a great sense of humor, and even in this portrait, if you look closely at Nell, she's kind of slouching a bit. It does mirror something that he saw in Whistler, but it's also showing her with one glove on and one glove off, and, it's like she's also kind of a little bit over-posing for him, but there's also this concern of the sisters for their brother. So it's quite a complex work. It shows this incredible mastery of textures, of paint surfaces, but also really nailing those portraits. And for me, it was a great joy to be able to just put it on its own at the end of the exhibition as what is his great masterpiece.
Yeah, I really agree with you, and I think the longer I've spent with this painting, the sort of more powerful that I have found it. I think that it's very poignant, this idea of the evening. Like it's late at night, and you talk about Nell maybe being sick of posing with him, but also being tired, perhaps at the end of a night. They've obviously been out. But then there's this sort of great intimacy, isn't there? It's just like the last hours. Almost, as that they're going to be together. So there's trust and familiarity. And I think what you say about the wings behind, it's an amazing painting.
Yeah, it's really, something that is brought close into our field of vision. And so it has this kind of immediacy, and it does transcend time. I think it is a work that it has that it factor. It doesn't matter how much we talk about it. It has this kind of mysterious quality, and many people have brought their own selves to it and have responded to the work in such interesting ways.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks,
Look, thank you
Adriane.
very much, Deborah. It's been just a wonderful overview of this exhibition, and really very pleasurable to have this conversation. And now we have the opportunity to open up to questions for those of you who've sent some in. And I suppose we'd just like to take perhaps the first question. And this question is, Oh, Deborah, what is your favourite piece in the exhibition, and why?
Oh, well, thanks, Kevin, for that question. I kind of gave the game away a bit, didn't I, with that one, talking about Two Girls in White. But, you know, in a way, it's very good not to have favourites as such, because the more time you spend with particular works, they kind of work on you. So, you know, I think some days I come in and I look at Jessie with Doll, or I look at something that maybe isn't so out there as like an obviously great painting. And even yesterday I came in and I thought, oh, that, you know, things that I maybe hadn't focused on so much become new favourites. So, you know, a particular portrait that I had focused on differently that day stands out more. So, you know, it's kind of good to have different favourites during the course of the exhibition. But thanks for your question.
So thank you. And our next question comes from Sue, and she asks, are there any contemporary artists you know of that have been hugely influenced by Ramsay?
That's a very interesting question. You know, I think there are a number of artists who have drawn on Ramsay's work. I think a number of portrait artists have looked at his work. It's hard to sort of pinpoint one person. I had the art, just thinking off the top of my head, I've had Patrick Pound, for example, selected one of Ramsay's works, the one that we looked at of the studio, and he found that a very enigmatic and entrancing work and included it in one of his exhibitions, which in a way are like an artwork. And there's also the artist John Walker wrote to me and said how he really loved the late self-portraits, which are Ramsay questioning his mortality, and you know, they're quite affecting works.
Yes.
So you know, a number of artists have responded in different ways, contemporary artists. Yeah.
So thank you. We have another question now from Vi, and it's, what characteristics do you think make his work so timeless?
Thanks, Vi. That's actually a really good question, because, you know, I think the thing that separates Ramsay, for me anyway, from some of his contemporaries is that a lot of his works they don't have the artifice. You know, if you think of some of his contemporaries like Rupert Bunny or George Lambert, you know, great artists, but there's a lot more artifice in the works. You know, I think with Ramsay, he pairs things right back to, he's got a real sense of focus. He really directs us to look at things in a way that kind of takes them out of time as well as being, you know, of their time, but kind of goes beyond that. And because there aren't all those signifiers of the time, you know, I think that it's really focused on that human aspect, which is about our human experience, about our humanity.
Do you think it's also a little bit about the fact that he displays so openly like the skills and the work of the artist?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a really good point, because they are very much, and I think that's the artist thing. It's about the making in the studio. You know, they are about that paint surface taking us into the making. So, yeah, thanks, Adriane. That's really true.
Yeah, thank you. And so we have another question from Celeste, and she just asks, are any of other Ramsay's family members also artists, or was he a prodigy?
Yes. So, you know, I think not really. I think none of the other family members were artists, but they were all really keen on music. You know, a number of the paintings actually show musical instruments, and, you know, so they were quite a creative family in many ways. But, yeah, I think perhaps not so much artists in their own right.
So we have now a question from Lindy, and I think that this is one that's come up over the exhibition a number of times. And, you know, we know that you talked about Ramsay dying at the age of 28, and I suppose it's the idea of how would his work developed had he lived longer. Would he have become an abstract artist or an impressionist artist? Are there any hints in his notebooks or his letters or his sketchbooks?
Yes. Well, I mean, that's really such an important question, to think about what he would have done. And, you know, there have been some interesting comments. You know, I had initially said, you know, I really want to focus on what Ramsay did, because so often people said to me, what would he have become? But it's an unavoidable question. Just before before I go on to that, I should say there are other younger Ramsay members who might be budding artists. So those of you out there, Ramsay had a big extended family, so I'm sure there are some people out there. But to come back to this, you know, really the question that so many people ask, what would he have become? Of course, I can't really know, but I think there are some really interesting signposts. So you know, there are works where he shows us, for example, in his sketchbooks, quite tough images about looking at himself, sometimes with half his face in shadow. There are indications that he could have worked in a more modern idiom, you know, something that does come through in some of the works already in the exhibition. So, you know, I think that my sense of it is he wouldn't perhaps have become so much an out-and-out modernist, you know, probably a little bit more like his friend Lambert, continued to be a figure painter, but, you know, Lambert himself did things that were in accord with the modern world, and I think within that realm of portrait painting, I think, you know, Ramsay would have continued to experiment, and perhaps that element of abstraction might have become stronger. Thank you.
So we have time just for 2 more questions.
Okay.
So the first one I'm going to read out comes from a JM, and it says, is this exhibition going to travel to other venues in the future?
Thanks, JM. Sadly, no, this exhibition isn't going to travel. You know, it's something that makes today really special to be able to share the exhibition with a wider audience. But you know, the sad answer is that no, we've had so many exhibition loans in this show, so it's been quite costly to bring it all together. But I hope a lot of people have had the chance to see the exhibition, and if you hadn't, that you at least enjoyed a glimpse of it today. So thank you.
And our very last question, Deborah, also is very sort of along a similar vein, and it comes from Dean, and he says, is it possible to keep the exhibition open for another 2 weeks when, in fact, the gallery reopens?
Well, you know, unfortunately, I think we're all in a situation at the moment where we really don't know what the future holds. So, unfortunately, I'm like many of us now just in this situation of not knowing. So, I'm sorry that that's a question that I can't answer. But again, all I can say is that I hope you've enjoyed this this showing today, and we'll keep you posted on what's possible. But you know, I think we're all in a little bit of a state of limbo right at the moment. I certainly feel like Hugh has weathered a few storms like the rest of us in Canberra with you know, the weather, and it's just been so nice that we have been able to at least keep it open until this week. So, but thank you for being part of this. Thank you.
Look, I'd like to thank you, everybody at home who tuned in and watched this today, and also very, in particular, Deborah Hart, the curator of the exhibition, for her generosity today. And we really hope, you know, on behalf of the gallery, that you enjoy this glimpse into Hugh Ramsay, and that we were able to have this opportunity, and we hope to bring you more such over the coming months when everything is so uncertain. So thank you very much for everybody watching, and farewell from the National Gallery of Australia, just for a little while. Thank you.
Take good care, and thank you very much, Adriane.
Thank you, Deborah. Yep.
And thanks to all of you out there.